When I came home from the hospital, there was nothing left. 3 days, that was all it took. 30 years of roses, specimens, carefully cultivated memory, gone to a dumpster somewhere off Route 9, replaced by bare dirt and a stack of glossy brochures for something called the Hartwell Patio Renovation. My daughter was standing in the middle of what used to be the garden, holding a glass of iced tea, smiling at me, with the particular brightness she reserved for moments she expected gratitude. "Mom," she said, spreading her free hand toward the wasteland behind her, "I did you a favor." I looked at that bare ground for a very long time. Then I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and called my attorney. I didn't cry until after I hung up, and those were the last tears Courtney Hartwell Draper ever got from me. But I should start from the beginning, because this story didn't begin in a garden. It began the way so many catastrophes do, with a telephone call from a hospital room and a daughter who answered it on the first ring. I have lived in this house for 34 years. My husband Henry and I bought it in the spring of 1990, when the neighborhood was still considered a gamble and the lot was overgrown with buckthorn and wild grape. Henry was a civil engineer who liked clean lines and efficient systems. But he understood from the beginning that the garden was mine, my research, my canvas, my extended laboratory. I had spent 22 years as a botanist at Crestfield University, and when I retired at 63, the garden became my full-time occupation. It was also the last thing Henry and I did together before the cancer took him 4 years ago. We planted the climbing roses on the south fence in the autumn of 2019, 2 months before his diagnosis. He chose the variety, a pale yellow climber called Graham Thomas, that he'd seen in a magazine and cut out the picture of. The cutting was still in his wallet when he died. I planted the second bare root in his memory the following spring, when the ground thawed and I could finally get outside again without sitting down on the steps and not being able to move for 20 minutes. After that, the garden became something different than it had been before. It was still my research space, but it was also the only place I felt close to him. My daughter knew this. She had visited enough times, walked through the beds enough times, listened to me explain the provenance of the Penstemon clutii and the particular conditions required for the Trillium chlorophyllum to thrive. Courtney was not uninterested exactly. She was the kind of person who listened to everything and retained nothing that wasn't immediately useful to her. She had been a real estate agent for 15 years and had recently married a developer named Blake Draper, who had the handshake of a man who priced everything he touched and the eyes of a man who was always doing math. The first time Blake stood in my garden, he asked about square footage. I thought he was joking. That was 3 years ago. I hadn't thought about it since. The mild heart attack happened on a Thursday morning in late September. I was outside, actually, staking the dahlias for what I didn't know would be the last time, when the pain started. It wasn't dramatic. A tightness, a shortness of breath, a sudden conviction that I needed to sit down immediately on the wet lawn. I called 911 myself. The paramedics were very kind. The cardiologist told me I was lucky it was mild, that my overall heart health was better than most women my age, and that with some medication adjustments and rest, I should be perfectly fine. They wanted to keep me for observation. 2 nights became 3 when my blood pressure ran stubborn. I called Courtney from the hospital. This is the part I replay sometimes, in the months that came after, running my thumb back and forth over the edge of Henry's garden notebook, wondering if I could have said something different, something that would have changed the sequence of events. But I don't think so. Courtney had been waiting for an opportunity. My phone call, was just the door she'd been standing outside for years. "Don't worry about a thing," she said, and her voice had that warmth in it, that particular frequency of warmth that I recognized later as the sound of someone who has just been handed exactly what they wanted. "Blake and I will come over and take care of everything. You just focus on getting better, Mom. Leave it all to us." I said thank you. I meant it. I had no idea what everything meant to my daughter. My closest neighbor, Marta Pauley, lived directly across the street and had been my friend for 16 years. She was 71, a retired school principal who kept herb beds in her side yard and had once gone toe-to-toe with the town zoning board for 3 hours over a setback violation. Marta didn't back down from things. She also didn't mince words, which is why, when she called me at the hospital on my second day there, her opening sentence was, "Vivian, there are men with machinery in your backyard." I felt the blood leave my face. My hand tightened on the phone so hard I could feel the seams of the case pressing into my palm. "What kind of machinery?" I said. My voice sounded very far away. "A small excavator and 2 trucks. Courtney's here directing them." A pause. "Vivian, they're taking everything out. The roses, they already got the south fence roses. They're working on the main beds now." The room tilted. The monitoring equipment began to register something interesting. A nurse appeared in the doorway, and I held up one hand to stop her because I needed to finish this sentence, needed to hear the complete shape of what was happening, even though part of my brain was already understanding it fully and was already shutting down certain doors so that I could stay upright. "Marta," I said, "how much is left?" Another pause, and in that pause I could hear her breathing, careful and measured, the way people breathe when they are trying to decide how much of a terrible truth to give you at once. "Not much," she said finally. "I'm sorry, honey. I don't think much." I stayed on the phone with Marta for 6 minutes. During those 6 minutes, the monitor showed my blood pressure doing things the cardiologist had specifically asked it not to do, and the nurse stood in the doorway with her arms folded and her face doing the professional version of deeply alarmed. When I hung up, I called Courtney. She answered immediately, which told me she had been expecting the call. "Mom, how are you feeling? Are you—" "Stop the work," I said. "Right now. Call them off." A beat. That particular quality of silence that contains a prepared speech. "Mom, I know this feels sudden, but the garden was getting to be too much for you. The physical labor, the bending, your heart, Mom. I talked to Dr. Westfield's office and they said—" "You talked to my doctor?" "Well, I'm listed as your emergency contact, so—" "Stop the work, Courtney. It's almost done anyway, and honestly, Mom, you'll love it when you see it. Blake has this vision for a beautiful patio space, and there are some really lovely container plants that don't require any—" I hung up. The nurse came in and asked if I was all right. I told her I was having a family difficulty. She brought me water and looked at me with that particular professional compassion that means, "I have heard much worse, and yet I still feel genuinely bad for you." I drank the water. I sat with my hands in my lap and the afternoon light coming through the hospital blinds in flat white strips, and I thought about the Graham Thomas roses on the south fence, the ones Henry had chosen from a magazine photograph, and I tried to find a way to believe that Marta was wrong about how much was left. I was discharged the following afternoon. Courtney came to pick me up, which meant I had to sit in her clean-smelling car for 40 minutes and look at the back of her head and listen to her talk about the patio vision. She had a brochure. She handed it to me when I got in the car. Stone pavers, a pergola kit from a home improvement store, container gardens with ornamental grasses. The word low maintenance appeared 4 times on a single page. I folded the brochure in half and put it in my purse without saying anything. The silence in the car had a texture. It pressed against the windows. "Are you mad at me?" Courtney asked, somewhere around the exit for Miller Road. I'm thinking, I said. Mom, I really was just trying to. I said, I'm thinking, Courtney. She was quiet the rest of the way home. When we pulled into the driveway, I made myself look at the yard before I got out of the car. I needed to see it as it was, not as it had been, because I have found over many years that the first unguarded look is the most honest one, the one before your mind starts adjusting, finding angles, softening edges. The south fence was bare, the main beds were gone, the dahlia stakes stood in naked ground like small, sad memorials. The old stone path Henry had laid, he'd done it himself over one long summer, each stone set by hand, was still there, but it led nowhere now. A path through an empty field. I got out of the car. I stood at the edge of the driveway and I looked at my yard for what felt like a very long time. Courtney stood a few feet away, holding her keys, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read but that contained, somewhere in it, the faint quality of satisfaction carefully being suppressed. Mom, she said, I know it looks bare right now, but imagine it in the spring. Thank you for the ride, I said. I'll call you. I thought I'd stay and I'll call you, Courtney. I went inside. I put my hospital bag down in the front hall. I went to the kitchen, made tea, and sat at the table with Henry's garden notebook in my hands. It had been in my hospital bag. I always brought it, the way some people bring a novel. It was a composition notebook, black and white cover, his handwriting filling every page in his particular cramped engineer's script. Dates and species names and little diagrams of where things were planted. 30 years of the garden in that notebook. Every plant we'd put in together. The Graham Thomas entry, his handwriting and mine together. S. Fence, planted October 14th, 2019. H.'s choice, pale yellow, should reach 8 feet. Below it, in my handwriting, added later, second bare root, S. Fence, March 22nd, 2020. In his memory. Bloomed June. I sat with that notebook for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called Marta. Are you home? I asked. I'm looking at your house right now, she said. Come over. Marta's kitchen smelled of lemon verbena and whatever she'd been baking, which turned out to be an apple cake that she slid onto the table between us with the efficiency of someone who understood that this conversation required provisions. She poured coffee without asking whether I wanted any, because she knew I always wanted some, and she sat down across from me and looked at me with her direct principal's gaze and said, How bad is it? The entire garden, I said. 30 years. Gone. Marta pressed her lips together. Blake's idea? I don't know yet. I wrapped my hands around the coffee mug. But I intend to find out. What are you going to do? I'm going to start by calling Gerald, I said. Gerald Finch had been my attorney for 12 years, a dry, meticulous man in his 60s who had handled Henry's estate and who had the expression of someone who had heard every variety of human misbehavior and was no longer capable of being surprised by any of it. Then I'm going to do some thinking. I saw the trucks leave, Marta said. Yesterday morning, the second day. There was a man in a suit with Courtney, not Blake, someone I didn't recognize. They were talking on the back patio for about 20 minutes. She had a folder. I set down the coffee mug. A folder, I said. Thick one, legal-looking. Marta's eyes were steady. I thought you should know. We stayed at the table for another hour after that, Marta and I, the way we had stayed at tables together over 16 years, through Henry's illness, through her own hip surgery, through the ordinary accumulations of long friendship that don't announce themselves as significant, but pile up into something irreplaceable. She refilled my coffee without asking. I ate more of the apple cake than I intended. We talked about the garden the way people talk about the dead, not with constant grief, but with the intermittent tenderness of memory that surfaces when it wants to. I told her about the Penstemon clutii, how I had sourced it from a botanical garden exchange in New Mexico, how it had taken 3 seasons to establish properly, and then had bloomed so abundantly that I had photographed it every June. I told her about the stone in the center bed that Henry had been inexplicably proud of, a flat granite piece, not particularly decorative, that he'd found in a stream bed on a hiking trip and had carried out in his backpack for 3 miles because he said it was the right size for the center of the garden, and he turned out to be correct. I told her it was still there, that stone, embedded in the bare dirt where everything else had been removed around it, because the crew had probably assumed it was foundational. That's something, Marta said. It is something, I said. She walked me to the door when I left and stood on the porch in the October cold, watching me cross the street to my own door, the way she had stood watching Henry come home from his last hospital stay, just to have eyes on the crossing. I waved from my doorstep, and she went inside, and I went inside, and the house was very quiet in the particular way it gets quiet at night when there's no one else in it. I drove home at 9 o'clock that night with the half of the apple cake that Marta insisted I take. The yard was dark, and the bare ground was invisible in the dark, which helped somewhat. I sat at the kitchen table with Gerald Finch's business card in front of me and the notebook open to the Graham Thomas page, and I let myself feel, fully and without interruption, the particular grief of this, the specific shape of it, not just the garden, but the deliberateness. The 3 days while I was lying in a hospital bed, the machinery, the folder with the man in the suit, the way Courtney had said, "Don't worry about a thing," with that particular warmth. I let the grief be there. Then I turned the page in the notebook to a fresh sheet, picked up a pen, and started writing down what I knew. I called Gerald the next morning. His assistant put me through immediately when I said it was urgent, which I appreciated. Gerald's voice was its usual flat, competent instrument. I told him what had happened to the garden. I told him about the man in the suit with the folder. There was a brief silence on his end, and then he said, "I'd like you to come in today if you can manage it. And Vivian, don't sign anything that arrives in your mail or by courier in the next few days. Don't sign anything at all." "Gerald," I said, "what do you think it is?" Another brief silence, the kind that contains a considered opinion. "I think," he said carefully, "that we should talk in person." Gerald's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, with the kind of waiting room that communicated quiet competence. Good wooden chairs, framed diplomas, no magazines from more than 6 months ago. His assistant brought me water, and I sat with it in my lap, watching the traffic on the street below through the window, until Gerald came out and shook my hand and led me back to his office. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he opened a drawer and took out a yellow legal pad and uncapped his pen. "The man Marta described," he said, "suit, folder, 20-minute conversation with Courtney. Did Marta have any other details? Height, age, the color of the folder?" "She said he looked like an attorney. She said the folder was blue." Gerald wrote something. "I'm going to make some inquiries," he said. "In the meantime, I want to walk you through something." He turned the legal pad to face me. He had written 2 words at the top: guardianship petition. "Your daughter is listed as your emergency contact and has access to your basic medical file. A mild cardiac event combined with what she might characterize as," he chose his words carefully, "difficulty maintaining the property could be the basis for a petition to establish guardianship. It would give her legal authority over your financial decisions." The water glass was cold in my hands. I set it down very carefully on the edge of his desk. "She's filing for guardianship," I said. "I don't know that yet, but I want you to be prepared for the possibility." He met my eyes steadily. The hearing, if there is one, would likely be within 2 weeks of filing. That's the standard timeline. I drove home in a state that I can only describe as a kind of cold clarity, like the feeling of stepping into very cold water and finding that instead of pain, there is only a sudden, total alertness. The grief was still there. It didn't go anywhere, but it had moved to one side to make room for something else. I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside, my hands on the steering wheel, looking at the house that Henry and I had bought 34 years ago. The house where we'd raised our daughters. The house with the bare yard that had been, as of 4 days ago, 30 years of work and memory. My daughters, plural. I had been sitting with that word, turning it over, ever since Marta mentioned the folder. Because Courtney and I had always been close, in the way that I understand now was a performance of closeness on her part. But Diane and I had not been close for 10 years, and that distance had come from something Courtney told me, a story about money, about a borrowed amount that Diane had apparently refused to repay, that had escalated into something ugly. I had believed Courtney. Of course I had believed her. She was my daughter, and she was there, and Diane had gone quiet and distant in the way guilty people sometimes do. But sitting in the driveway, with the legal pad notes from Gerald's office in my purse, and the understanding settling around me like cold weather, I thought, Diane went quiet. Or Diane stopped being able to defend herself to someone who wouldn't listen. I went inside. I made tea. I stood at the kitchen window looking at the bare ground, and then I opened my phone and scrolled to Diane's number. It had been there, uncalled, for 3 years. Before that, 2 years of slowly decreasing contact. 5 years total of distance. I stood there for a long time with my thumb over her name. Then I put the phone down because I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed to know more before I opened that door. The next day, the paperwork arrived. A courier brought it at 10 in the morning, a thick blue envelope, the same color Marta had described, with a return address from a law firm downtown. I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment, remembering Gerald's instruction, and then I carried it inside without opening it and put it on the kitchen table and called him. "Don't open it," he said, before I could finish explaining. "Bring it here." His expression when he read it was perfectly controlled, which meant it was not good. He read through the documents twice, very methodically, and when he looked up, his eyes had that flat, steady quality that I had come to understand meant he was angry in the professional way that attorneys allow themselves to be angry, contained, channeled, and about to become useful. "It's a petition for limited conservatorship," he said, "filed 6 days ago. The hearing is scheduled for 11 days from now." He turned a page. "Her supporting documentation includes a statement from a physician, not your cardiologist, but someone at the hospital, regarding cognitive and physical impairments observed during your admission." He set the papers down. "And there is an attached property assessment." I looked at the papers on his desk. A property assessment? A development assessment. Someone evaluated your property for subdivision potential. He met my eyes again. "The assessment was prepared 3 months ago, Vivian." 3 months ago. While I was in my garden, staking dahlias, tending the trillium beds. 3 months before my heart attack. 3 months before any of this, someone had been standing on the edge of my property doing square footage math. Gerald's office was very quiet. Outside, I could hear traffic. Somewhere below, someone's phone rang and was answered. The window light fell across the papers on his desk in clean white strips. They planned this, I said. That would be my reading of the timeline, yes. I exhaled slowly. I picked up the water glass he'd given me and took a sip and put it down again precisely. Gerald, I said, I want to fight this. I intend to help you fight it, he said, and something shifted very slightly in his expression, the professional containment allowing a single degree of warmth. I'm going to need some time this week to prepare. In the meantime, I want you to think about anyone who can speak to your mental acuity and physical competence. A physician of your choosing, colleagues, long-term friends, neighbors, he paused. And Vivian, the garden. Do you have records, photographs, receipts, documentation of the plants? Henry's notebook was in my purse. I reached in and put it on his desk. He picked it up, examined it, turned a few pages. Something moved in his expression that I didn't expect, something almost like recognition. He set it down gently. This is exceptional, he said. May I have it for the next week? Take care of it, I said. I will treat it like evidence, he said, which it is. I called Marta from the car. It's a conservatorship petition, I said. 11 days. Gerald is preparing to contest it. A silence. Then, very quietly, that daughter of yours. Marta, I paused. Has she called you? Courtney? She left a message last week, asking if I'd noticed any concerning behavior from you. Her voice was dry as sand. I didn't call her back. I absorbed this. She's gathering witness statements. Apparently. Another pause. Book club is Thursday. Margaret is hosting. You're coming. I don't know if I'm in the right state for Vivian. Marta's voice was firm, the principal's voice, the one that had ended many arguments and started none. You are coming to book club. You need to be around people who will make you laugh. And Margaret has a new bottle of that Sancerre she's been hoarding, and we are going to need it. Come. I came. Margaret Holt hosted in the house she'd lived in for 28 years, a sprawling Victorian that she maintained with the same relentless competence she brought to everything else, including the weekly flower arrangements she cut from her own front beds. At 73, Margaret had the posture of a retired judge, which she was, and the laugh of someone who had not allowed the world to make her earnest. She had been a circuit court judge for 18 years and had retired only because her husband's illness required her full attention. And she had spent the years since in book club, in her garden, and in occasionally devastating conversations with local politicians who made the mistake of assuming she was decorative. The other regulars, Dot Chen, 66, a former ER nurse who had the particular calm of someone who had seen genuine catastrophe and recalibrated her definition of emergency accordingly. Pauline Vasquez, 69, who had run a bakery for 30 years and whose books were always covered in small flower fingerprints. And Ruth Nakamura, 72, who had a boat, a very sharp wit, and an inexhaustible supply of opinions about everything, including the books we were nominally there to discuss. The book that month was a Donna Leon, a Brunetti mystery set in Venice, which Margaret had assigned on the grounds that we all need more Venice in our lives. And also, the scene where he reviews the documents is extremely satisfying. You'll see. We discussed it for approximately 45 minutes before the conversation migrated, as it always did eventually, to the actual business of our lives. I had not planned to bring up Courtney that night, but when Margaret refilled my wineglass and gave me the look she reserved for moments when she thought someone was managing an emotion inefficiently, I found myself putting the glass down and saying, "My daughter filed for guardianship while I was in the hospital." The room got very quiet. "The garden," Marta said to the others. "Tell them about the garden." I told them. All of it. The hospital call, the machinery, Marta's phone call, the man in the suit, Gerald's office, the blue envelope. While I talked, Dot set down her wineglass very carefully. Pauline folded her hands in her lap and said nothing. Ruth's expression had moved, by degrees, from surprise to something that was more specifically interested, the way her face looked when she was doing calculations. Margaret, when I finished, was silent for exactly 5 seconds. Then she said, "Did you say 3 months ago for the property assessment?" "That's what Gerald's documents show." "And the hearing is in 11 days. "Yes." Margaret set down her own wineglass. She picked it up again, looked at it, set it down again. "Do you know," she said, "what I find genuinely interesting about this, from a legal standpoint? The timing of the cognitive impairment claim. They filed before you were out of the hospital, which means they couldn't have observed the cognitive state they're claiming to have observed in any meaningful context. What they observed was a woman who just had a cardiac event in a hospital bed with blood pressure medications affecting her affect." She paused. "That's not a conservatorship case. That's sloppy paperwork." "I have Gerald," I said. "Gerald Finch is excellent," Margaret agreed. "But I might make a few calls as well, if you don't mind. I know the judge who will likely be assigned to this." She picked up her wineglass again. "Socially." Dot said, "What do you actually need right now, Vivian, practically?" "I need character witnesses," I said. "I need documentation of my competence. I stopped. "I need to find out what my other daughter knows." "The sister," Marta said. "Diane. We haven't spoken in 5 years. But there was something Courtney told me, something that drove the wedge. And given everything I now know about how Courtney operates," I stopped again. "You think it was manufactured," Ruth said. "I think it's possible." The silence that followed was thoughtful. Outside, the October wind moved through Margaret's maples with a low, continuous sound. And inside, the lamp on the side table cast a pool of warm light over the half-empty wineglasses and the stacked books and the 5 of us sitting with the particular weight of a serious problem that was beginning, very slowly, to feel like something that could be addressed. "You know," Pauline said suddenly in her mild way, "in the Brunetti book, the thing that breaks the case open is the document that was there the whole time, just overlooked." Everyone looked at her. "The garden notebook," she said. "The one Gerald has. Plants, dates, everything Henry planted. That's not just sentiment. That's documented horticultural work over 30 years. She paused. "What were some of the rarer specimens?" "Trillium chloropetalum," I said. "Penstemon clutii, a Calochortus species I propagated from seed myself. 3 heirloom rose varieties I'd sourced from specialty growers." I paused. "And the Graham Thomas climbers on the south fence, 2 of them." Pauline nodded slowly. "Those are not common," she said. "Those are not things you find at a garden center. Do you know what rare and documented heirloom roses and specialty botanical specimens are worth when they're established and healthy?" She looked at me steadily over her wineglass. "My sister is a horticultural appraiser. She does estate work and insurance valuations." The room was very quiet. "Pauline," I said. "She's in Warwick," Pauline said. 40-minute drive. She owes me a favor." She took a small, precise sip of Sancerre. "Or she will, after this." Ruth had been doing her quiet calculations throughout this exchange, and now she leaned forward in her chair with the look of someone who has finished a problem and is ready to announce the answer. Here's what I think, she said. The conservatorship case falls apart if you're clearly, demonstrably competent, and a 30-year horticultural research record is pretty compelling evidence of sustained cognitive function. The property assessment becomes evidence of pre-planned financial exploitation. And if Blake's company is the one doing the development deal, you're looking at potential conflict of interest claims on top of everything else. Dot refilled everyone's wine without ceremony. I want to say something, she said in her quiet ER nurse's voice. I've known Vivian for 9 years. I have watched her identify a Fritillaria meleagris from 30 feet away, remember the botanical names of species I've never heard of, and once correct a wrong diagnosis in my presence at a dinner party, politely but completely accurately, based on a symptom description someone mentioned in passing. She took a sip. If anyone is going to call Vivian Hartwell cognitively impaired, they are going to need considerably more than a hospital admission blood pressure reading and a daughter's say-so. Dot, I said. I'm putting that in a written statement, she said, if Gerald wants it. He will want it, Margaret said. Ruth said, I want to come back to the property assessment. 3 months ago. So this wasn't opportunistic. This was the plan before the cardiac event. Apparently. The cardiac event was just timing. Any opportunity would have served. She tapped her fingers on the arm of her chair. Do you know, in the Brunetti series, there's a recurring theme about how the most dangerous criminals are the patient ones, the ones with the long timeline. She paused, and then, to the room rather than to anyone specifically, I find it interesting that the entire plan depends on the garden being worthless, bare dirt, no value. If the garden had documented value, it does, I said. It has documented value. The notebook has 30 years of it. The room was very quiet. Pauline, Margaret said, turning to her. I was getting there, Pauline said mildly, and set down her wineglass. There's one more thing, I said. I had been sitting with it all evening, turning it over. Diane. Call her, Margaret said, without hesitation. It's been 5 years. Call her, Margaret said again, and her voice had the same quality it must have had from the bench. Not unkind, just absolutely certain about what needed to happen. I called Diane the next morning. She picked up on the 3rd ring. There was a pause after she heard my voice, the kind of pause that can mean many things. Surprise, old hurt, a checking of emotional inventory before speaking. Then she said, Mom? Diane, I said, I need to tell you some things, and then I need to ask you some things, and I am sorry that it has taken me this long to make this call. Another pause, shorter. Okay, she said, go ahead. I told her about the hospital, the garden, the conservatorship petition, the property assessment from 3 months ago. As I talked, Diane's silences changed quality, from the cautious listening of someone managing old distance to something colder and more focused. When I described the folder Marta had seen and the timing of the filing, Diane made a sound that was not quite a word. Mom, she said when I finished, can I tell you something? Please. 5 years ago, when Courtney told you about the money, the loan I supposedly refused to repay, she stopped. I heard her take a breath. There was no loan. There was never a loan. What there was that I found out Courtney had been adding herself to financial accounts. Your accounts. I didn't have hard proof yet, but I confronted her about it, and within a week, she'd told you that story about the money, and you... She stopped again. And I believed her, I said. The silence between us was long. Outside my kitchen window, a crow landed on one of the dahlia stakes in the bare yard and sat there for a moment, very still. I should have pushed harder, Diane said. I should have... No, I said. I should have listened. I should have asked questions. I paused. I am asking them now. Are you willing to help me? I heard her exhale, a long, slow breath, like something releasing. Yes, she said. Tell me what you need. Diane drove up that Saturday. She pulled into the driveway in a sensible gray sedan and got out, and we stood in the driveway and looked at each other for a moment before she crossed the distance and hugged me. She looked like Henry around the eyes. She always had, more than Courtney, the same directness. She was 46, thinner than I remembered, with gray threading into her dark hair, and when she pulled back from the hug and looked at my yard, her expression did something complicated. 30 years, she said quietly. 30 years, I confirmed. We went inside. I made tea and she sat at the kitchen table and we talked for 3 hours. And by the end of it, I had 3 pages of notes and Diane had a very clear picture of what her sister had been building. And she was angry in the particular quiet way of someone who has been proven right about something they wished they'd been wrong about. She has done this before, Diane said. Not at this scale, but the pattern is the same. I know, I said. I understand that now. I have some documentation, she said. Bank statements from that period. I'd made copies because I was concerned. And texts. I kept the texts. She looked at me steadily. I should have given you all of this 5 years ago. I'm sorry. Diane, I said, we are going to move forward. We are not going to look backward anymore except to gather what we need from back there. She nodded. She picked up her tea. After a moment, she said, What's that in the yard? Are those... She squinted through the kitchen window. I followed her gaze. 2 geese were standing in the middle of the bare south bed, regarding the dahlia stakes with apparent contempt. They were Chinese geese, very large, very opinionated, a variety known for their territorial nature and their complete indifference to what anyone thought about them. I had acquired them 4 days earlier from a man named Carl Pettigrew, who kept a small farm off Miller Road, on the grounds that they were excellent for natural ground management of disturbed soil. Carl had not asked many questions, which I had appreciated. Those are geese, Diane said. They are, I confirmed. You got geese. For the yard, I took a sip of tea. Gerald thought it was perhaps eccentric. Marta thought it was magnificent. Blake had a difficult encounter with the larger one this morning when he came to drop off some forms. Gerald also thinks that was perhaps somewhat satisfying to observe. Diane looked at the geese. She looked at me. Then she started laughing. Really laughing. The kind that has to bend forward slightly. And after a moment, I laughed too. And it was the first time in 2 weeks that anything had felt like breathing. I should describe Blake's visit because it became rather well known in the neighborhood. He had arrived in his white SUV at 9:15 in the morning with a manila envelope and an expression of elaborate casualness, the kind people wear when they have practiced in the mirror what they're going to say. He rang the bell. I opened the door. I did not invite him in. I brought some documents for you to sign, he said, holding out the envelope with the smile of someone who expected this to go quickly. Just some property-related paperwork. Courtney asked me to bring them by. I'm not signing anything, I said. My attorney has instructed me not to sign anything. You know that, Blake, because you have an attorney too, and your attorney has been in contact with mine. Blake's smile held. He was good at the smile. Vivian, this is just routine. Behind me, I heard the back door open, and then the particular aggressive honking that indicated the geese had identified an intruder. I don't know how they got around to the front. I suspect Marta, who had been in her front yard at the time, may have been able to explain, but she has never felt called to do so. What I know is that Blake backed up very quickly, dropped the manila envelope on the front step, and made it to his SUV in a time that I found genuinely impressive for a man his age. The larger goose, Pauline had named him Maurice, which had stuck, stood at the end of the driveway for approximately 90 seconds after the SUV pulled away, honking with what seemed like personal satisfaction. I picked up the envelope and brought it straight to Gerald. It was not routine paperwork. It was a preliminary agreement to withdraw contest of the conservatorship petition in exchange for voluntary transition of property management. There was a highlighted line at the bottom for my signature. Gerald photographed every page and added it to the file, and his expression during this process was the expression of a man adding another beautiful brick to a wall. "They're getting nervous," he said. "Good," I said. The hearing was 8 days away. Those 8 days had the quality of days just before a storm breaks. The particular charged stillness of waiting, everything in sharp focus. I slept badly and rose early and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with Gerald's file and Henry's notebook and my own pages of notes, running through the sequence of events, checking for gaps, testing the logic. I had always worked this way, methodically, attentively, through 22 years of research and 30 years of garden. And I brought the same quality of attention to this that I had brought to cataloging a new botanical species. Patient, thorough, nothing overlooked. Gerald called on a Wednesday morning with a development that changed the shape of everything. "I've located the corporate structure behind the development deal," he said. "Blake's company is listed as one principal, as we suspected. The other principal is a property holding company registered in Delaware." He paused. "The registered agent for that Delaware company is the same law firm that filed your conservatorship petition." I set down my coffee. "They're the same entity," I said, effectively. "The conservatorship was filed by the same legal apparatus that stands to benefit from the sale." He paused. "That is a significant conflict of interest. It's potentially fraudulent filing. Can you use this?" "I have already prepared the motion." There was something in his voice, satisfaction, thoroughly professional, like the sound of a precisely placed keystroke. "The judge assigned to your case is a woman named Patricia Holloway. Margaret knows her." "Margaret mentioned that." "Margaret called her." Another pause. "Socially." I absorbed this. "Gerald, are we going to win this?" He considered the question with his usual methodical honesty. "I believe the case for conservatorship is fundamentally unsound, and that we have compelling evidence of premeditation and fraud. I believe Pauline's sister's appraisal of the destroyed garden, which I have now received and which is quite remarkable, will be important for damages. I believe your daughter Diane's documentation is very useful." He paused. "I believe we are in a strong position. That is the most I will say before a hearing." I thanked him. I hung up. I sat for a moment at the kitchen table in the October morning light, and I thought about everything that had been set in motion. By my heart attack, by Courtney's planning, by the machinery in my garden while I lay in a hospital bed. I thought about the Graham Thomas roses and Henry's handwriting in the notebook, and Diane's face when she arrived in the driveway. I thought about Maurice the goose standing in my driveway with the absolute conviction of someone who had assessed the situation and found the intruder's departure appropriate. Then I opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. I called Marta. "The hearing is Thursday," I said. "I think you should be there." "I was already planning to come," she said. "Margaret, too. And Ruth. She's wearing the blue blazer," she said. She wore it at a congressional hearing once. She thinks it gives the right impression. What about Dot and Pauline? Dot has a shift until noon, but she's coming after. Pauline is bringing her sister, the appraiser, in case she's needed. A pause. I'm also bringing the apple cake, for after. I laughed. I hadn't expected to, but I did. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. This was expected. I hadn't slept well in 2 weeks. I got up at 4 in the morning and made tea and stood at the kitchen window in the dark, looking at the yard. The geese were invisible in the dark, presumably sleeping in the shelter of the fence. The dahlia stakes stood in the faint light from the neighbor's security lamp. The stone path Henry had laid, leading nowhere. I thought about what I was walking into in the morning. Gerald would present the conflict of interest motion, the appraisal, Diane's documentation, my own testimony. Courtney's attorney would present the physician's statement and whatever else they had assembled. The judge, Patricia Holloway, whom Margaret knew socially, would hear both sides and make a determination. I thought about the blue envelope arriving at my door, the man in the suit with the folder, the development assessment prepared 3 months before my heart attack, before any of it, before Courtney had any way of knowing I would end up in a hospital, which meant she'd had a plan that required the cardiac event, or was simply prepared to act on any opportunity. The hospital was just the first one that presented itself. I thought about Diane saying, "There was never alone." I thought about 5 years of distance from my daughter, 5 years of believing a story that had been constructed specifically to remove a witness. I stood at the window until the sky began to lighten at the edges, the slow, gradual recovery of blue from black that happens in October, earlier than summer, the light arriving carefully. I stood at the window until the sky began to lighten at the edges, the slow, gradual recovery of blue from black that happens in October, earlier than summer, the light arriving carefully. I thought about a line from the Donna Leone novel we'd read at book club, something about how the most honest documents are the ones that were never meant to be evidence. Henry's notebook had not been meant to be evidence. It had been meant to be memory, a private archive of 30 years, the kind of record a scientist keeps, because a scientist cannot help but keep records. That was what I was. That was what I had always been. 30 years of notations, dates, species, observations, the small and large events of a garden's life recorded in the handwriting of 2 people who had loved each other and loved the ground under their feet. It had not been meant to be evidence, but it was very good evidence. I went upstairs, changed into clothes I had laid out the night before, came back down, fed the geese, and sat at the kitchen table with Henry's notebook open in front of me until it was time to leave. The courthouse parking lot was half full at 9 in the morning. I sat in my car for 3 minutes after I parked, a habit I'd developed over the past 2 weeks, a small, reserved moment before any significant event. My hands on the steering wheel, the particular October smell of leaves and cold air coming through the cracked window. Gerald had told me to be confident, not combative. He had told me to answer questions directly and not elaborate unless asked. He had told me to look at the judge when I spoke, not at my daughter. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel. They were not shaking. They had not shaken, I realized, for several days now. The trembling had stopped somewhere around the time Diane arrived, or perhaps around the time Maurice chased Blake Draper's SUV out of my driveway. I wasn't certain of the exact moment. I got out of the car. Gerald was waiting by the entrance, briefcase in hand. Next to him stood a woman I hadn't met in person. Compact, 60s, reading glasses pushed up on her head. Pauline's sister, I realized, the horticultural appraiser. "This is Eleanor Vasquez," Gerald said. "She's here in case the judge has questions about the appraisal." Eleanor shook my hand firmly. "I have to tell you," she said, "that in 20 years of horticultural appraisal, I have almost never been as angry about a case as I was writing that report." "That bad?" 3 established heirloom climbing roses, including documented Graham-Thomas specimens of that age, a propagated calochortus, Trillium chloropetalum you'd been cultivating for over a decade. She shook her head. "The replacement value is significant, but the actual botanical and historical value, the loss of specimens that simply cannot be replaced, is incalculable. I said so in the report." In those words. I absorbed this. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," Eleanor said. "Win." Inside the courthouse, in the high-ceilinged corridor outside the hearing room, I saw Courtney. She was standing with her attorney, a man in a good suit named Harrison, whom Gerald had described as competent and ethically flexible. And she was holding a leather portfolio and not looking in my direction. Blake was not present. I had expected his absence. When I learned later that he had that morning been served with documents by Gerald's associate attorney regarding potential fraud in the conservatorship filing, his absence made complete sense. Courtney looked, I thought, slightly less certain than she had in my driveway, holding her iced tea. The particular brightness was still there, the performative warmth, but there was something underneath it that I recognized from when she was 9 years old and had done something she knew she was going to have to account for, a quality of braced expectancy. She looked at me finally when I was about 10 feet away. Her expression went through several things in quick succession: the brightness, then something more complex, then a settling into a careful neutral. "Mom," she said, "you really didn't have to. Gerald could have handled this without—" "I wanted to be here," I said. Her attorney was already moving toward the hearing room door. She turned to follow him, and I watched her go. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and calm, with the fluorescent pragmatism of a working legal space, rather than the grandeur of something on television. Judge Holloway was in her 60s, with reading glasses and an expression of contained attentiveness. She looked at the room the way experienced judges do, taking in everyone and giving nothing away. I won't reconstruct the entire hearing in sequence, because it ran for 2 hours, and much of it was the procedural and legal language that Gerald had prepared me for. The kind of language that sounds like architecture, being built one careful stone at a time. What I will say is this: Gerald presented the conflict of interest motion first. He laid out the corporate structure, Blake's company, the Delaware holding entity, the law firm, methodically, each document placed before the judge in sequence. Harrison objected twice. Both times, Judge Holloway listened to the objection and said something brief and did not appear to be finding it persuasive. Courtney's expression, beside Harrison, was very still. Gerald presented Eleanor's appraisal. He presented Diane's documentation, the bank statements, the text messages, the pattern that they established. He presented Henry's notebook with its 30 years of entries, the dates and species and careful notes. He presented a brief written character statement from Margaret, who had, in her past life, signed many legal documents and knew exactly what weight and precision such documents required. Then I testified. Gerald asked me questions for approximately 20 minutes. I described my botanical career, the garden, the 34 years in the house, the hospitalization, what I found when I came home. I described what the Graham-Thomas roses had meant to me, and I used precise language because precision is what I had: names, dates, the specific entry in the notebook. Not because I was trying to be moving, but because that was the truth. The truth of those plants was specific and documented. When I looked at Judge Holloway while I spoke, her expression did not change, but her attention was absolute. Harrison cross-examined me for perhaps 10 minutes. He asked about the cardiac event, about my medications, about whether I had experienced any confusion or disorientation during my hospital stay. I answered each question directly and factually. I did not elaborate unless asked. I looked at the judge when I spoke. At one point, Harrison said, "Mrs. Hartwell, would you say that your attachment to the garden, the intensity of your concern over its removal, might indicate difficulty adjusting to new circumstances, an inflexibility that—" "Mr. Harrison," I said, and my voice was very steady, "I have a doctoral degree in botany, 34 years of property ownership with no incident, a fully documented 30-year horticultural record, and I have spoken with more coherence in this room in the last hour than your filing demonstrates. What else would you like to establish about my cognitive function?" A brief silence. Harrison moved on. The judge asked one question at the end directly to me. She said, "Mrs. Hartwell, in your view, what was the purpose of destroying the garden?" I thought about this for a moment. Then I said, "I think it was meant to diminish the property's established value so that the purchase price in the development deal would face less challenge. And I think it was meant to present me as someone who needed management, someone whose 30 years of work could be removed in 3 days without consequence." Judge Holloway's expression did not change. She made a note. Her ruling came 40 minutes later, after a recess in which I sat in the corridor with Marta and Diane and Gerald, drinking coffee from a machine that was better than expected, while Marta held my hand and Diane sat very straight with her arms folded across her chest and the expression of someone waiting for a long-anticipated outcome. The petition for conservatorship was denied. In the ruling, Judge Holloway noted the conflict of interest in the filing, the lack of credible evidence of cognitive impairment, and the troubling pattern of premeditation suggested by the documentary record. She referred the fraudulent filing question to the county attorney's office for review. We were in the parking lot when Courtney came out. Harrison was beside her, already speaking to someone on his phone, already managing the next thing. Courtney walked to where I was standing with Gerald and Diane and stopped. She looked at me for a moment. The brightness was completely gone. She looked, I thought, like someone standing in the middle of a space that turned out to be smaller than the map indicated. "Mom," she said. Her voice had lost its warmth and was just sound. "I was trying to—" "Courtney," I said, "I changed the will last week, before the hearing, so that there would be no confusion about whether this outcome affected it. It's already done." I paused. "Gerald has the documents." She went very still. "The will is already changed," I said. "Has been for 9 days. You just didn't know to ask." She stood there for a moment, her portfolio clutched to her chest, and then she turned and walked to Harrison's car. And he was still on his phone, and she stood beside it waiting, and I turned away. Diane was standing 2 feet behind me. She had heard everything. Her expression was complicated. Not quite satisfaction, not quite grief, something between the two that I recognized from the mirror. "Are you okay?" she said. "I'll be okay," I said. "Come have apple cake." What happened in the weeks and months after moved with the rhythm that legal and financial consequences tend to have, steadily, inevitably, without the drama of the hearing, but with the accumulating weight of outcomes. The county attorney's office opened an inquiry into the conservatorship filing, which I am told is still ongoing. Gerald filed a civil claim against Blake's company and the law firm for damages related to the property destruction. The appraisal Eleanor provided with its precise dollar figures for replacement value and its separate accounting for the incalculable loss of irreplaceable botanical specimens, gave the claim a very solid foundation. The development deal, without my property, collapsed. The Delaware Holding Company was quietly dissolved. I do not know the exact details of what this cost Blake, but the white SUV was eventually replaced with a smaller model, and Courtney and Blake relocated to a condo in the city, which Courtney listed on social media as a fresh start in a new chapter, the way people do when the previous chapter ended in litigation. Diane and I had lunch every 2 weeks through November and December, and by January, it felt like something that had always been there. Not the 5-year gap, but the connection before it, the one that had existed when she was in her 20s, and I was still teaching, and we would call each other on Sunday evenings to talk about nothing in particular for an hour. That connection didn't disappear, it turned out. It had just been covered over, the way a garden covered over with gravel still has the root systems underneath, still has the memory of what grew there. In the spring, Diane helped me begin the restoration. The stone path was still there, Henry's path, every stone exactly where he'd placed it. We worked from the outside in, reclaiming the beds, preparing the soil. Pauline's sister Eleanor, who had become something like a friend in the months since the hearing, helped me source replacements for some of the lost specimens. Not replacements exactly, because you cannot replace 30 years, but plants to begin with, new entries for the notebook. The Graham Thomas climbers were gone. I had understood from the first clear-eyed look at the bare south fence that they could not be replaced. Those specific plants, with their 30-year establishment and their particular provenance. But Eleanor located a specialty grower in Vermont who had bare roots from the same heritage stock, and in March I planted 2 of them against the south fence in the spots I knew by heart. I recorded them in Henry's notebook, in the space after the last entry. Fence, replanted March 15th. Graham Thomas, heritage stock from Vermont, will take time, V.H. asterisk. Below that, in the margin, I wrote a date that I didn't label, the date of the hearing, and next to it, just 2 words. We won. Maurice and his companion, whom Marta had named Celeste after a character in the Brunetti novel we'd read that fall, remained in residence in the yard through the winter. Carl Pettigrew, from whom I had acquired them, came by once to ask if I wanted to return them, now that the yard situation was resolved. I told him I had become attached. He nodded as if this was completely reasonable, which I appreciated. The geese had strong opinions about everything, protected the yard with territorial commitment that no fence could match, and were very funny to watch. When visitors arrived, they found suspicious. They had opinions, specifically about Blake's car, but since Blake had stopped coming, they had transferred their attention to the occasional delivery driver, which was perhaps less targeted but equally passionate. Book club continued as it always had. We rotated houses. In November, we read a Josephine Tay, Margaret's Choice. In December, a Penelope Fitzgerald that Dot had been recommending for 2 years. In January, Ruth brought a novel about a woman who builds a garden after her husband dies, which she described, incorrectly, as not relevant, I just thought it was good. We disagreed about the ending for 3 weeks. It was exactly as it had always been, which was exactly what it should be. One evening in early March, a Tuesday, I drove home from Gerald's office in the low, late afternoon light that is particular to early spring. Not warm yet, but thinking about warmth. The sky a very clean blue, with the light leaving it slowly from the west. I turned onto my street and pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment in the car before getting out. The yard was quiet. The geese were in the back, invisible. The stone path ran from the driveway to the front door exactly where it always had. The south fence was bare, except for 2 thin canes, 4 feet tall, still working on their first spring. Small, fragile, with the particular determination of things that have not yet done what they intend to do. I sat there for a while, looking at those 2 canes against the south fence. Henry had chosen them from a magazine photograph, cut out the picture, and kept it in his wallet. Pale yellow. Should reach 8 feet. I had written those words in his handwriting the first time, and in my own handwriting the second. And there was a third entry now in the notebook, my handwriting again, less certain. Will take time. Time, I had found, was the thing I kept learning about, how it bent, how it recovered, how the things you planted in it with attention and care were still there in some form, even when someone arrived with machinery and a plan and 3 days while your back was turned. The root systems, the memory of what grew there, the notebook that was in your bag in the hospital and therefore survived everything. I got out of the car. The air was cold and smelled like soil and the very beginnings of something. That particular smell that arrives in March before anything visible happens, when the ground is still deciding. I stood on the stone path for a moment, and then I walked to the south fence and crouched down beside the nearer cane and looked at it closely. 2 new leaves, very small, very green, just starting. I straightened up. I went inside. I made tea, and I sat at the kitchen table with Henry's notebook, and I opened it to the March entry, and below the sparse record of the replanting, I added a line. March, first leaves, both vines. Time. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the geese honked once, a conversational sound, not alarmed, just registering that evening was coming. The notebook was warm in my hands. On the windowsill, in the fading light, the tea steamed. I sat there for a long time, and it was quiet, and it was mine.